Greetings, I'm Salvador Cordova. Welcome to the Evidence and Reasons for the Christian Faith video channel. This is part 3 of a nerd critique of thermodynamics and information theory in the Abiogenesis series by James Tour. I'm pleased to announce that I was recently voted the #1 YouTube creationist by evolutionist YouTubers. Though the evolutionist YouTubers sharply disagree with my views, they rated my arguments in the top tier and rated me highly also in my interactions with them. With that in mind, I will strive to maintain scholarly excellence and civility on this channel. This particular video is not so much a critique as it is a supplemental section and appendix to explain and elaborate some of the concepts in the first 2 videos in the series of critiques of James Tour's Abiogenesis series. Unfortunately, this could be some very dry and arduous material, but as a bonus, we'll explore some of the problems for abiogenesis that arise from equilibrium mixtures of prebiotic building blocks and their contaminating isomers. The primary purpose of going into this material is to show that using thermodynamics and information theory recklessly can be like opening a can of worms of confusion. I liken using thermodynamics and information theory to playing with dynamite. Like dynamite, thermodynamics and information theory can be used to powerfully break up certain claims of the abiogenesis and evolutionary community. But more often than not, the use of statistical mechanics, thermodynamics, information theory explodes in the hands of ID proponents trying to use it. There is certainly a place for statistical mechanics and thermodynamics in the study of ID, but the topic requires far more understanding to use these concepts than might be supposed at first glance. I hopefully will cover one application of information theory in advanced ID theory that actually passed secular peer review, and it has been part of my professional work in the area of bioinformatics and structural biology. But that's for another day. This video tries to give a taste of what thermodynamics and statistical mechanics is all about, and I'll let the viewer decide for themselves if these areas are the areas they really want to wade into as far as the origins debate is concerned. For myself, I studied these disciplines because the math and physics were beautiful and interesting and complex, and to be frank, they were graduation requirements. There are applications in the engineering world and in chemistry where thermodynamics is very important. I merely question their applicability in the origins debate when easier and clearer arguments are available, such as those that I outlined in episode 2 on protein probabilities. With that, let's go to the slideshow. My presentation is, the title of my presentation is The Relevance of Purification, Spontaneous Contamination, Mixing Entropy, Configurational Entropy to Abiogenesis. So we have all these various topics, and I'm going to try to show, help the reader decide how relevant these concepts are to the question of abiogenesis. Maybe as an illustration, consider the problem of purification. If we have a mix of coins, for example, such as depicted here, it doesn't spontaneously become well ordered as pictured here, where we take certain coins of a certain type out and then also arrange them in a specific way. Now, as I mentioned, as I alluded to in episode 2, we could say that this is an improbable configuration. It's very unlikely you could ever repeat this pattern, this arrangement of coins exactly as it is, just by randomly mixing them together. But that sort of improbability isn't astonishing. It wouldn't signal to the ordinary person that any thought was really given to arranging the coins this way. However, if we saw an arrangement of coins like this, that's another story, and there's reasons for that, such as the violation of the law of large numbers, and then also the fact that it was selectively purified out of, hypothetically, it was chosen out of a source of a variety of coins. So it stands out, and one can reasonably infer human intelligent design in the creation of such a pattern if one encountered it. Now this idea of purification has relevance to the origin of life. And I'll say, you could see the title here. It says, Uniformity Enables Readability. For the same reason that a railroad track is nicely uniform, it enables the train to travel it, because the spacing between the rails is relatively uniform. It makes train travel feasible. So that same geometric consideration plays out in creating various structures in biology. It's very desirable that there be a degree of uniformity so that molecular machines can traverse the DNA here and read it and duplicate it and transcribe it. It's a very desirable property. If we had different molecules randomly occurring here, it would not make this readable. And even supposing that one could build machines that could traverse this DNA to read it, to be able to extract the recipe, the information to make proteins, which make a large amount of the body parts. Even supposing we could have a non-uniform way, a way of reading a non-uniform assembly, it's still a problem for abiogenesis how this uniformity came about, and that's similar to the problem of how, if supposing that we started with a mix of coins, that they would end up being, we would end up selecting only a certain class of coins and orienting the coins in a certain way, such as all heads with the, in this case, the head of the statue here, the head here, George Washington pointed up. And that's a similar problem here. So if we have this, as I said, we suspect intelligent design if we encountered a configuration like this, because it's a violation of the law of large numbers. A similar consideration happens here when we have this uniformity, when all that we know about chemistry of the molecules involved would suggest that we wouldn't have uniformity. It would be there'd be a strong tendency for things to scramble rather than be purified and organized. Now, to be fair, there are some things that spontaneously organize, such as if we had an emulsion of water and oil, just left to itself, it's going to spontaneously separate. So there are conditions where spontaneous separation and organization happen. But there are also situations where spontaneous disorganization happens, and that does have some relevance to statistical mechanics and thermodynamics. So this is just, let me just start with kind of a simple conceptual model. For the sake of argument, the blue dots represent a monoatomic gas of one species, and the red dots here illustrate another species of an ideal monoatomic gas. And we have a system here where we have two separate containers separated by a valve that is closed. And so you could see that there's kind of a nice purified organization here. If we were to open the valve, the molecules would spontaneously mix, and they will, if we have enough molecules, they will not spontaneously unmix. I hope that's easy enough to see. All of you, I'm sure, have had the experience of mixing. Like if you mix your coffee and cream, you can see that it's easy to mix, it's very difficult to unmix. And it's kind of the same principle here. So what does this have to do with thermodynamics and abiogenesis? First, the problem of abiogenesis. This illustrates the problem of mixed substances that are hard to unmix. James Tour mentioned relay synthesis in abiogenesis experiments. Relay synthesis in abiogenesis experiments sweep away the problem of mixed substances rather than properly acknowledging the fact that mixed substances are an enormous problem for abiogenesis. Using purified substances is an illegitimate model for abiogenesis. I'll repeat again. Using purified substances is an illegitimate model for abiogenesis. And I will elaborate on that a little more. But without purified substances, one doesn't, for example, get this uniformity in DNA. You could see here this beautiful repeating pattern that enables the reading of DNA. That's very important. Not to mention, even if somehow we could make something readable even with kind of this some sort of non-uniform architecture, it still leaves us with a problem as to why the DNA has only certain classes of molecules. It is, again, analogous to this. It poses this problem here. So the problem of mixed substances, I'm going to cover this a little bit more. But the problem of mixed substances is only the beginning of the problems. There's a worse problem. It's not only that the substances mix, but even when you have a pure substance, there's spontaneous contamination. The substance you may think is pure is going to convert itself to something you don't want, and I'll cover that more. So going back to this very simple illustration with the gases, and it also applies to molecules in solution, but the gases have nicer math associated with it, and that's why I'm talking about gas. This idea of pure substances, again, is a problem that how we can get substances isolated and purified is a problem for abiogenesis. And as I said, it relates to the problem of readability of DNA. But there are other problems in the synthesis of what we call ATP, the kind of the chemical energy of living things. In being able to synthesize this chemical called ATP, this chemical called ATP, there have to be kind of compartments where we have an abundance of positive hydrogen ions or protons here, and a relative absence of them here. And that kind of creates something of like a pressure that will drive the ATP synthase machinery to start making ATP. It's very intricate, interesting process. So the idea of being able to compartmentalize things also appears in other contexts. And again, if you just think of this being kind of compartmentalized, just look back at this diagram. So it's kind of the same concept, being able to purify and compartmentalize. That's not easily achieved. And here is a depiction of a nerve cell. Outside the nerve cell, we have a certain concentration of sodium ions, and in the inside of the nerve cell, we have a certain concentration of potassium ions. Again, this is very similar to the compartmentalization here. That compartmentalization is very important in the cell to be able for us to live. And that what I'm trying to point out here is that compartmentalization doesn't spontaneously happen. This is a problem for both abiogenesis and other evolutionary scenarios after abiogenesis. So anyway, let's proceed. So we have this very simple illustration and conceptual diagram of mixing. So let's add a little bit of statistical mechanics and thermodynamics to the analysis. We can actually state in terms of entropy the change going from this organized state here to this disorganized state here, and we call that mixing entropy. Now I'm going to qualify this. Entropy is not always a measure of disorganization. It can be correlated, but it's not the same thing. I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself here. So it's for this reason sometimes people say entropy is a measure of disorder. That's an obsolete viewpoint, but sometimes it can be. Sometimes it can be, but not always. So maybe that's the way to express it. Entropy can sometimes be correlated with disorder, but it has to be under certain circumstances. In general, it's not. The viewpoint that entropy is a measure of disorder is an obsolete view, and I'll cover some of that a little more. So now we can actually express the change in entropy. Now, does that just to point out what the purpose of this is, this talk is, does that really help you understand what's going on here? If you can, just because you can calculate some figure of entropy of mixing, it's rather clear that the substances mix and they're not going to unmix. Throwing this mathematical analysis on it doesn't immediately add more insight. It's useful for other things, but for the question of abiogenesis, it doesn't really add any insight, and that really is my point. But just to belabor the point and maybe to add sufficient distaste, I'm just going to do a little bit more math. So if you find this distasteful, that's part of what I'm trying to do. Now, there are two independent formulations of mathematical formulations of entropy. Rudolf Clausius first came up with an indirect definition of entropy in terms of the change of entropy, and it's the integral of the heat divided by the temperature. The integral of the differential of heat divided by the temperature. And then Ludwig Boltzmann came up with this alternative definition called, it's engraved on his tombstone, where it's Boltzmann's constant times the natural log of the number of microstates. This W here is a very difficult concept, and I'm going to have to talk about that a little bit more. These are two independent formulations of entropy, and it's very important. What that does is Clausius' definition describes how it can be done at the macro scale. So if you had thermometers and calorimeters, you can calculate the change of entropy. That's very helpful. What Boltzmann did is he related this to what happens at the atomic level. By the way, Clausius didn't even know about atoms, or he didn't, at the time he had no idea, and he had a very strange idea of what heat is. He had what was called the caloric theory of heat. Boltzmann had a far better understanding years later with the atomic models, and that was also groundbreaking because at the time it wasn't universally accepted that atoms existed. So that was very bold of him to be suggesting that we can define the ideas of heat and temperature in terms of atomic movements. And so what this enabled us to do is to measure entropy with thermometers and calorimeters, and we could we could estimate what's going on at the molecular level without actually seeing the molecules. A famous example of this was Linus Pauling was able to estimate the molecular structure of ice based on the measured change in entropy. So they would measure the entropy change using Clausius' definition, and using Boltzmann's definition, Linus Pauling was able to estimate the molecular structure of ice. Okay, so that's just a little background. So this is very powerful that we had two independent ways of defining entropy. One is kind of used more at the macroscopic level, where we can determine it with calorimeters and thermometers. And then the other concept is to be able to determine entropy based on molecular interactions. When we tie the two together, we're able to use our laboratory macroscopic measurements to infer what happens at the molecular level. So going back to this, all right, do we really want to throw all this math in helping us understand mixing? And I will leave that decision to you. I'm just going to kind of pound this a little more. The concepts of entropy can be derived, by the way, without assuming the second law of thermodynamics. Entropy defines the Planck statement of the second law. That means one needs to assume a definition of entropy before one can state the second law, if we use the Max Planck statement of the second law. And again, this is the S equals Boltzmann's constant, KB, times the natural log of W, or omega. Now, omega is the count of the number of microstates. That is a concept that's independent of the second law. So what's the meaning of microstates? It's non-trivial. Just to show you what I mean, there are classical versus quantum microstates. To understand the classical microstates, one needs to understand something like the Liouville theorem, which involves the Hamiltonian in classical mechanics. And one starts dealing with this six-dimensional hypercube. I mean, this is just nasty stuff. This is just nasty stuff. Thankfully, in certain contexts, the quantum microstate is easier. Now, if these terms are just blowing you away, that's part of my point. Do you really want to go there? Okay? It was painful when I was studying it, and to be perfectly honest, I've forgotten a lot of it. I'd have to really crawl through a lot of my old textbooks to try to relearn it, which would be, I think, a nice exercise if I could find the time. So suffice to say, this term W is non-trivial. To understand this term W or omega, to really grasp its importance, you have to study stuff like this. And I assure you it is not fun, okay? So I'm trying to scare you away. I hope I've done that for some of you. Now, some of you out there who like being tortured mathematically, you're going to enjoy walking through that. So again, S is for entropy, W or omega is the number of microstates, and KB is Boltzmann's constant. Now, Boltzmann had a different formulation of the second law. He said entropy increases most of the time, but there are exceptions, albeit very rare. And there is a reference that talks about a little bit about the atomistic formulation. So now, why would Boltzmann say that it happens most of the time? For a large number of molecules, you could see this is not going to unmix. But let's say, suppose, hypothetically, you had only one molecule of the blue gas here and one molecule of the red, and they're just bouncing around, going back and forth. Hypothetically, there's a situation where the blue gas could bounce over here and then bounce back here, and the red gas could bounce over here and then bounce back, and you could have them then essentially be organized where they started, in the sense that the blue gas is on the left and the red gas is on the right. And so that's what for very sparse systems of gas, that's one situation where entropy increases. It's hard to say what entropy actually does, and that's what the qualification that entropy increases most of the time, and that's all it means. When I was studying statistical mechanics, they said, some of this starts to the kind of are what we would call laws kind of have exceptions when we start dealing with very, very, very few molecules. And so I'm just pointing that out, why Boltzmann said most of the time. So going back here, we have this mixing process and entropy will increase. Now I'm going to emphasize that, let me see if I can go back here. This formula for the change in mixing entropy is assuming an isothermal adiabatic process. That means when we go from this situation to this situation, where we have two substances and they're pure and separated, going to the situation where they're mixed, this is assuming we have a process where the temperature doesn't change and no heat is added. So that's what we mean by isothermal, same temperature, and adiabatic means that there's no heat added or removed from the system. The situation changes when we have a non-isothermal, non-adiabatic process. So if we're adding heat, like say to this system, just to the closed system, if we're adding heat, we're going to raise the temperature, we'll actually change the entropy here. We don't even need it to mix. And that, I'm going to point out why that is problematic. One can clearly see here that the system is still nicely organized, where we have purified substances separated. But just by merely adding heat, we're changing the entropy score. And my point is, entropy then, in this context, is not a very good measure for the organization of the system in terms of purity. And that's what I'm saying is a problem. This ends up confusing the whole issue, because just by changing the temperature, even though the organization is not changed, the level of entropy is changed. And my whole point is then, why use entropy as a measure of purity or organization when it can be changed? Now, to do stuff in a non-isothermal, non-adiabatic process, if we're dealing with idealized monatomic gases, we thankfully have formulas like this. This is called the Sackur-Tetrode equation. And if it's a non-ideal gas and it's non-monoatomic, it's going to get a little, could be a little or substantially nastier. So am I scaring you off? That's kind of half the point. And so adding heat here will increase the entropy score, and conversely, we can have a mixed system here, but if we just cool it off, we can lower the entropy score. So now this is the Sackur-Tetrode equation, and just for the sake of completeness, I'll explain the variables here. N is the number of molecules. So if you could hypothetically count the molecules here, that's what N means. Let's see. V is the volume. Okay, so let me go back here. So the volume of this container is simply V. U is the internal energy. U is the internal energy. So we can, the proper term is internal energy, U. Colloquially, we might call it heat energy, but that I need to emphasize that's for the real sticklers and formalists out there. They don't like using the term heat energy. Thermal energy, internal energy. That's just how when the molecules are bouncing around, if they have more velocity, it has higher temperature, it has higher kinetic energy. and it bounces around more, and we can say it has higher internal energy. That's all it is. So if you can imagine here, if this were an animation, just imagine the blue dots moving at a certain speed, and if we increase the temperature, they're going to bounce around at higher speed. That's internal energy. For idealized monoatomic gases, that's a nice way to describe it. It gets a little more complicated when we have diatomic or multiatomic gases. That's more complicated. Okay, if you think if this is scaring you off, that's part of my point. K is Boltzmann's constant, M is the mass of the gas particle, H is Planck's constant. In the video description, I decided I'm going to give some of the diehards out there just a toy. I've implemented the Sackur-Tetrode equation, and you can just play with these variables, and you could see the result of the entropy. It'll be a spreadsheet, and you can use the spreadsheet to calculate the entropy. So if we want to calculate the change in entropy for a non-isothermal, non-adiabatic process, if we're changing the heat and then mixing it, you'd need to use the Sackur-Tetrode equation. You'd have to use it twice, one for the blue gases, one for the red gases, where the masses hopefully are different. So this is not nice. So you use one set of formulas if you're changing the temperature and adding or subtracting heat. You use another formula to calculate entropy if you're not doing that. And that's what we call in the case of isothermal adiabatic process, you use this formula and you get this mixing entropy formula. Okay, this is, again, the point of this is if it's making you miserable, that's part of the point. Do you really want to wade into this and apply it to abiogenesis? If you're saying, well, how is this relevant? That's exactly what I'm trying to say. That's the question I was asking. How is this relevant to abiogenesis? How is this relevant to abiogenesis? And so when I hear all these ID proponents saying, oh, thermodynamics, information theory, I'm just like, can you demonstrate the relevance to help or at least show why it makes the argument clearer? Now, in light of all this, I need to point out a very respected chemist. He lived to be 100 years old before he passed away. God rest his soul. Frank Lambert. He was an American academic who was professor emeritus of chemistry at Occidental College, Los Angeles. He graduated from Harvard, so he's very, very smart. He got his PhD at Harvard, I believe. He is known for his advocacy of changing the definition of thermodynamic entropy as disorder in U.S. general chemistry texts to its replacement by viewing entropy as a measure of energy dispersal. He died in December 2018 at the age of 100. So what I've tried to point out with all this is entropy may or may not be used to measure disorder, especially in non-isothermal, non-adiabatic processes. All bets are off as far as its ability to measure organization. You don't want to use that. In other words, it's very clear here that this is an organized system and purified. You don't need to use entropy to establish that. You don't want to use, you're just going to add confusion. And it's great that a scientist like Lambert has pointed out that the idea of calling entropy as a measure of disorder is an obsolete view. How that came about is because of some passing remarks by Boltzmann himself and also Josiah Gibbs. But from what we know now, that we can dismiss those as those passing remarks as mistaken passing remarks, and it wasn't reflected in their math anyway. So it's been agony for many years since the time of Boltzmann that people are trying to figure out why is it this disordered. And I'll cover a little bit more with an analysis done by Robert Gange, but let's move forward. So again, I'm just beating a dead horse here. what does invoking thermodynamics and statistical mechanics add to simple understanding of the problem of mixing? I'd say it doesn't add much, if anything, just confusion. The problem of mixed substances for abiogenesis is forcefully and clearly stated by the fact that synthetic chemists resort to techniques like high-performance liquid chromatography, HPLC, Dr. Tour mentioned HPLC, or polyacrylamide gel electrophoresis, PAGE, and GASP relay synthesis. Dr. Tour mentioned all these. So we can state the problem of organization or purity without reference to thermodynamics. Just do it the way James Tour described. Just do it. That was what was so powerful about his lecture. So if anything, my critique is affirming the 98% of his abiogenesis series that didn't touch on thermodynamics. It's so clear what the problem is without adding these extra confusion factors. The problem of mixed substances is not really helped by appealing directly to statistical mechanics and thermodynamics. That's not to say it has no role. It has a role, but it's in very advanced stuff. But for elementary analysis like this, I'd argue it's not helpful. I'd say it's a minefield of confusion. So it says how to survive a minefield. I love this cartoon. And I'll say a way to survive a minefield is not to walk into it in the first place. And I hope I've done an adequate job of scaring you away from thermodynamics. And again, don't swat a fly with a sledgehammer, especially if the fly is on your hand. Use a sledgehammer for breaking up rocks, not killing flies. So now, that being said, there are some underlying principles from statistical mechanics, which is related to thermodynamics, that may not be obvious, but which pose problems for abiogenesis, particularly the purification problem. So I'm not writing it off altogether, but now it's not going to be easy to see the connection, and one may or may not absolutely need it anyway. So going back to this illustration of the coins and separating them out. So we have a mixing problem here. We don't need to use the mixing entropy formula, okay? But we can see that it's mixed. And the problem is getting it purified, where we select out only specific coins and orient them in the right way. Now, by way of analogy, this hints of the problem of homochirality. In homochirality, you have only left hand for amino acids and right hand for carbohydrates. And so this all heads configuration is analogous to the homochirality problem. Now moving on. As I said, that this purity and then also being able to orient things in the right way is really important to enable readability of DNA. And even if readability wasn't the issue, we still have the problem of why we have pure substances. And also regular, consistent orientation and connection of the parts. And again, that's analogous to the George Washington pointing a certain direction, pointing upward. So this is a depiction of the ribose, deoxyribose. So DNA is deoxyribonucleic acid. And if I could point this out, we have if you see this molecule here, that's the deoxyribose molecule right here. Formerly, it's called the D2 deoxyribose, and it's specifically the deoxyribofuranose form, beta. So what does this have to do with the purification problem in statistical mechanics? The problem is that in an aqueous solution of deoxyriboses, that means if we put the deoxyribose in water, we end up getting spontaneously it'll generate these contaminants. We'll have 75% of this, which we don't want, 0.7% of this, and only 25% of this. The numbers don't exactly add up. That's mostly a rounding error. It's supposed to add up to 100%. For those astute, if you add these 75% plus 0.7% plus 25%, that's 100.7%, and that's not exactly 100%. So just suffice to say, that's just a rounding issue. But the important point is we get a lot of this stuff that we don't want and only a little bit of this when we're trying to make this, and we're trying to use only the Furanose form, the beta Furanose form there. How does that happen? Well, in biological systems, it only makes the nucleotides with the beta Furanose form of deoxyribose, like that. And then it has machines like a polymerase that stitch it together one nucleotide at a time. But in any case, this is a problem in a prebiotic soup, because what's highlighted in green is what you want. So that's pretty bad that even when you try to isolate this out, nature is going to try to manufacture all this contaminant spontaneously. So unlike the situation earlier where we had one might have a hope of separating ideal monatomic gases, and there are methods of doing that just by say chilling it and getting one gas to liquefy. In the case of biology, you don't get that purification, because the moment you try to isolate this and let's say you try to remove some of this deoxyribopyranose from your mixture, what's going to end up happening is some of this will convert to this spontaneously. So there's no way you're going to purify this. It's just going to spontaneously make more of what you don't want. And that's what happens when, chemistry students are familiar with the idea of equilibrium conditions of solutions. This is what's going to happen. And Dr. Tour's very astute. He said, how do you get around that problem? That's not going to be easy if you're trying to put this in a soup. The moment you try to purify out the impurity, it's going to make more of it. And it's even worse than the diagram that I was showing, because it's actually 5 forms. So this is the furanose form. We have the alpha here, the beta here, and then we have the 2 pyranose forms, and then this linear form. And the one we really want is this one here to make DNA. So if we start to purify this out, nature is going to take this and make more of the junk. So all this stuff about natural selection happening in abiogenesis, that's garbage. Because when you select out what you don't want, you eliminate what you don't want, you end up making more of it. That's how real natural selection works, not the fantasized selection that I hear being invoked by internet, YouTube, abiogenesis proponents. That's real selection at work. It's not the survival of what, so to speak, of the fittest. It's creation of more junk. That's what really happens. And so, those of you familiar with the behavior of solutions in equilibrium, where you have isomers spontaneously forming, that's what's going to happen. And the problem is worse. So deoxyribose has this chemical formula C5 for 5 carbons, H10O4. That's 5 carbons, 10 hydrogens, 4 oxygens. There are so many chemicals with that formula, but they're just structured differently. We call them isomers. We have the we have the quote-unquote the right-handed one, but then we have the left-handed one, which is undesirable. This is again the homochirality problem, and the problem gets worse. Dr. Tur talked about dry synthesis. Okay, so in the liquid form, we have all of these, we at least have hope of getting this right form that we want for DNA. And there is a dry synthesis of DNA, but the problem in a dry synthesis is if we were only starting out with deoxyribose, we would end up with this pyranose form. And I'm citing this here. The pyranose form in the dry state that doesn't have what you want at all. So if we try to solve the problem by taking out the water, you end up destroying this. This goes away. It's gone in dry synthesis. So adding water makes a problem. Removing the water makes an even worse problem. And you're just stuck. And I'm just going to throw in my personal, this is not scientific, this is just a personal view. God chose some really tough materials to make it miserable for abiogenesis researchers. He picked some real doozies just to make their job miserable and to show that he's the designer. Okay, that's a personal opinion. That's outside of science. But I would just like saying that is some genius to pick out these materials to build life with, because it's the very sort of material that's going to frustrate abiogenesis researchers trying to show that it can happen naturally. And by the way, in passing, that's the biotic message. The designer made this to resist naturalistic explanations. The biotic message, an idea by Walter Riemann, and I had a video on that. So here are some citations, just in case some of you are questioning what I'm saying. I'd like to kind of just set the record straight. So, how does this relate to statistical mechanics? The aqueous equilibrium condition leading to equilibrium proportions of the 5 isomers probably can be framed in terms of statistical mechanics concepts. A Gibbs free energy change might be stated solely in terms of entropy change, in terms of entropy change, and it might indicate the difficulty of preventing spontaneous generation of undesirable substances. I'm sorry for this sentence. I totally botched that up. That's on me. A Gibbs free energy change, if there's no change in enthalpy, and I'm sorry for throwing these terms at you, but there's no way I could do this without using those terms, and it's going to take too long to explain it. But so then this is really for the people that sort of understand the terminology. A Gibbs free energy change might be stated solely in terms of entropy change. That'll happen if the enthalpy term is 0. So Gibbs free energy then can be equated with the entropy change at a certain temperature. And this will indicate the difficulty of spontaneously forming this. It'll indicate the difficulty of spontaneously formation of this molecule, which makes, which is the central part of the nucleotide that's part of the DNA. But again, as if to beat a dead horse, but one can simply point out the problem of spontaneous generation of junk chemicals. This can be done without immediate reference to the second law or entropy. They said that's the main takeaway. If you're saying, Sal, why are you scaring me off with this? That's the point. Steer clear of thermodynamics if at all possible. Use simpler arguments. This is a very simple argument, okay? I'll state this argument simply. You spontaneously get a lot of junk. And when you try to clear out the junk, it'll make more of that junk. That's what happens in kind of this equilibrium chemistry. That is a problem for abiogenesis. So now an appendix. All right, I'm going to finish up this segment, and it's already almost been an hour. And I know this has been grueling. And so I salute all of you that really find this to be nerd heaven. So this is nerd heaven, I hope, for some of you, because it could be torture for the rest. I'm going to point out there is this book by Robert Gange, Origins and Destiny. It is available for free. It was endorsed by a Nobel Prize winner, Eugene Wigner. Wigner won the Nobel Prize in physics. And I mentioned Frank Lambert, who said entropy is not a measure of order or disorder. Maybe to understand the issue is we can correlate reading ability with shoe size for children. I know that sounds stupid, but think about it. A second grader has, on average, smaller shoes, or let's say a kindergarten kid has smaller shoes in general, on average, than, say, a junior high student. And we can also say that the reading ability is better. You know, the junior high has better reading ability than a kindergarten. So we can say, okay, if we want to estimate someone's reading ability, we take their average of. If we want to estimate the reading ability of a particular age group, we could either note their age and we can estimate their reading ability, or we could measure their shoe size and we can correlate the shoe size with reading ability. I mean, that sounds kind of ridiculous, but it can be done. The point is that shoe size is not the same thing as reading ability. It can be correlated, but the fact that it can be correlated does not mean it's the same thing. Reading ability can be correlated with shoe size, but reading ability is not the same thing as shoe size. So with that in mind, consider what Gange is saying. We noted earlier that entropy can be correlated but not identified with disorder. And we said, moreover, that this correlation is valid in only 3 cases: ideal gases, isotope mixtures, and crystals near 0 degrees Kelvin. The truth of the matter is illustrated by considering the 2 chemically inert gases, helium and argon. In our mind's eye, we imagine 2 balloons, one filled with helium and the other with argon. First, we lower the temperature of both balloons to 0 degrees Kelvin. This makes all the gas molecules stop moving in either balloon. Next, we get the molecules moving by heating both balloons to 300 degrees Kelvin, room temperature. Were we to mathematically calculate the increase in entropy, we would find that it was 20% higher. It was 20% higher in the argon balloon than in the helium balloon, 154 versus 120 joules per mole per degree Kelvin. But since helium molecules are 10 times lighter than argon molecules, they are moving 3 times faster and thus are more disordered. Here then is an example where higher entropy is accompanied by lower disorder, thereby demonstrating that we cannot identify one with the other. In the particular example cited, the greater argon entropy comes from the closer quantum translational energy levels identified with its greater molecular mass as described by the Sackur-Tetrode equation. And going back again to this nasty example of a non-adiabatic, non-isothermal process. I'm sorry to just blast through this. There we are. This is the Sackur-Tetrode equation. And I showed another counterexample along the lines of Gange where the order and disorder will not be correlated with the entropy if you're messing around with the temperature. So that's another example in addition to Dr. Gange. But I just wanted to show that I'm not alone in my complaints about calling entropy a measure of disorder. It can be correlated, and that only occasionally. So again, a little bit about the Sackur-Tetrode equation. It only applies to idealized monatomic gases. You need another equation for entropy. if you're dealing with another substance, which makes the calculation of entropy just nasty. And we covered what all the variables mean. So there's this thing called configurational entropy. So we talked about mixing entropy. Mixing entropy is a form of configurational entropy. Configurational entropy just means the configuration of the atoms or molecules or particles in space. So when we if we have here this this container and the gas molecules are only on the left and we open it, we've changed the configuration of how the particles can move around. That's all. And that's kind of what configurational entropy is. So when we just by opening the valve here, we have a change in entropy, and it's identified by this equation, and it can also be done alternatively with a sacchartetrode. But this is for an adiabatic isothermal process. That means no heat added or subtracted, and it's at the same temperature. This equation is only valid here in that situation, and it's a change in configurational entropy. And so this V term in the sacchartetrode equation affects change of entropy there, and it's a change in configurational entropy. Now, if we simply add heat, we're changing the U term in the sacchartetrode equation, and that's going to change the entropy here. Or if we add more molecules, so in that case, it's really an open system. You're either adding or subtracting molecules, you'll change the entropy. So now I hope you're learning way more about entropy than you ever wanted to, unless you are an ultra nerd and you're finding this to be nerd heaven. So we can get all this in some of the textbooks like that listed here, that's available for free. I'm going to point out, you see this calculation here that calculates the entropy change going from this confinement here to just letting it expand to the other container. The change in entropy, just look at the term here, and it really is the terms here in the mixing entropy, and that derivation, the relationship can be described in chemistry textbooks like that. And you have to say, and if you're scratching this head, what does this have to do with anything? And that's exactly my point. What does this have to do with anything in understanding abiogenesis? Why would someone eagerly want to be exploring these concepts? And you're just like, well, what does it have to do with anything? Okay, but since someone by the name of Ben Rex, his handle, he wanted a little bit of tutorial on the differences between thermal entropy and configurational entropy, I'm going to give it, and that's going to be the end of this agony here. The change in total entropy is the change in thermal entropy plus the change in configurational entropy, and that's from this framing of entropy, of total entropy, is usually in material science classes, and I'm not sure that it's generally true, but in material science, for the systems they deal with, they accept it as true. I know one physicist who really cringes at this kind of compartmentalization of entropy being thermal and configurational. But the change in thermal entropy, see if I could illustrate it here. That's when we're just changing U, the internal energy. That means, like, if we had a 3D animation here, a low internal energy means you see the molecules bouncing around slowly. Higher internal energy, they're bouncing around quickly. It's more complicated with non-ideal, non-monoatomic gases, but that's a simplification that's close enough. So we change thermal energy by changing the internal energy. Configurational entropy can be also considered in terms of the number of ways in which atoms themselves can be distributed in space. And so that's when we're changing the basically the size of the container. Like if we're dealing with gases, that the gas can occupy, a simple change in that will change the entropy. It's a change in configurational entropy. Unfortunately, there are other kinds of entropy that are configurational, such as the deal with homochirality. So we could say entropy of configuration is the entropy of mixing plus like the racemization state. I can't absolutely vouch for that because I don't have a reference, but I'm pretty sure that's correct because from this book on stereochemistry, we can infer it. And I'm not going to go through this. This is just, I'm already beating a dead horse enough. I'm just going to give this reference. You can infer the change in entropy when we go from the homochiral state to the racemic state. And so now you can start to see how this is, when James Tour's talking about homochirality, it does have a relation to statistical mechanics and thermodynamics, but the connection is not that clear, and I had to do a lot of digging to make that connection. And then again, do you really need it? Do you really need it? Because it suffices to say that nature just will take, as seen with the stuff with deoxyribose, nature spontaneously makes junk. So even when you clear out the junk, it's going to make more junk. And that's the same thing here with the problem of homochirality. If you have left-handed amino acids and right-handed amino acids, you try to filter out the right-handed amino acids, nature will force the left-handed amino acids to make more of the right-handed. It's going to make more of the junk that you don't want. And again, just interjecting a personal theological opinion that's formally outside of science, I think God chose some really cool materials to frustrate abiogenesis researchers who are insisting that this can happen naturally. I could hardly think of any materials he could have chosen that would drive the point home that he exists, because this is a nasty problem. So this stuff with racemization, and I'll also point out here, free energy changes also favor degradation of RNAs. So all this statistical mechanics, yes, it does have an application that you get degradation, you get creation spontaneously of junk. You can demonstrate that with statistical mechanics, or you could just simply accept it as an empirical fact that's experimentally established. I prefer going with the easy stuff and just say it's experimentally established. We notice it. It's helpful, it's comforting that we can show that physics also predicts it independently. And that means physics and chemistry is against naturalistic abiogenesis. They are running out of options, even though they falsely advertise themselves as making advances. The more we know, the harder it looks for life to spontaneously arise. So some references, this 1984 book, Intelligent Design, Mystery of Life's Origin by Bradley Thaxton and Olson. I believe that would be chapter 8, they show they made the arguments in terms of thermal entropy and configurational entropy, and they were saying that this term has to be resolved. There has to be a way for making highly sequenced proteins, and they called that resolving the configurational entropy problem. But I think the authors, particularly, I'm pretty sure it was Bradley who wrote that, made it a million times harder argument. I hope that my arguments in episode 2 that didn't appeal to changes in configurational entropy was clearer in arguing why proteins are unlikely to form spontaneously, functional proteins. This book is available for free online. You can look at how they originally framed the argument in terms of thermodynamics. It was groundbreaking at the time, and at least it was trying to argue with science. I think it didn't succeed as far in light of what we know today, but that in 1984 was almost 40 years ago, and a lot has happened now. We can make the arguments better now, but the first arguments were using thermodynamics, and I just, at the time, I said it looks cool, but I just didn't feel completely comfortable. I didn't feel it was complete, and it has been my goal since reading this book. It was an intelligent design book, to try to make the arguments more complete. And episode 2 conveyed the way that I've attempted to make it more complete. So, moral of the story, don't swat a fly with a sledgehammer, especially if the fly is on your hand. The sledgehammer is a metaphor for thermodynamics, statistical mechanics, and information theory. The fly is the abiogenesis problem. I'm just suggesting use other tools to attack abiogenesis than thermodynamics and information theory and statistical mechanics. So just backing up a little bit, there are more accessible arguments to arguing against abiogenesis. I would say the law of large numbers, the purity problem, the geometry problem. We don't need all this fancy stuff. I'd say that there's a lot of unnecessary mathematical theatrics from thermodynamics and statistical mechanics and information theory that hurt rather than help clarify the issues. And much as I was inspired, and actually this book here, Mystery of Life's Origin in 1984, made me an ID proponent, it left something to be desired because it appealed to thermodynamics. But the rest of the book was great. It'll echo a lot of James Tour. And so that's what I mean. We don't need all this mathematical theatrics. In fact, when people can't understand what you're saying, that your argument is already starting to fail. And that's why I say it hurts rather than helps clarify the issues. You can use those disciplines for solving other problems, not for problems that can be far more forcefully stated with simpler arguments. And how can that be done? Well, Dr. Tour's lecture, by and large, did this correctly. He made the arguments correctly in the sense that he made them accessible and they're clear. It was really funny when he said, how are you going to polymerize something when water's present? What are you going to do, remove the ocean? I mean, that was really good, And he said, what are you going to do? How do you do degassing? How do you have a degasser there in the abiogenesis, Where do you have the chemists there to do the purification with HPLC and Page? And I wish I could imitate him with his New York accent. It was just beautiful. That's how to hit home. And so I say stick with or stay with the chemistry and avoid wandering into unnecessary arguments. So with that, this torturous lecture is finally done. And I'd like to invite the viewers, if they haven't, you can support this channel for free by hitting like and subscribe. This helps search engine rankings so interested viewers can find this content. Also, please refer us to people you think would benefit from this content. So that's it for this series. I hope even in the process of being tortured like you have, in this last episode, there's been some benefit and enlightenment. So take care and God bless you.